The young woman, quote, has always thought of herself as half black and half white because her mother is Irish Lithuanian and her father West Indian. Yet again, the parent populations tested for, at least as Shriver described them, were described only as Western European and West African. And Lithuania is generally considered a part not of Western Europe, but of Eastern Europe, and therefore technically not part of the population tested for. And again, while West Indian was clearly used as her kind of cipher for her African ancestry, one can be white, like Alexander Hamilton was, while being so-called West Indian. And the Irish certainly weren't considered white in colonial times. So similarly, East Asians have long gone in and out of being considered white in our American history. South Asians, many being the closest descendants of the original so-called Aryans, are generally not thought of as white in this country, yet the incoherent use of Aryan is apparent in any dictionary, and I quote Webster's, which defines Aryan as 1, Indo-European, 2, Nordic, 3, Gentile. So this jumble of who we are as residents of the New World with its centuries of rapid recent migrations is never explored in our popular media. And the single mention of migratory patterns, I think, is misleading. The students whose DNA revealed both African and European ancestors were described as, quote, members of the fastest growing ethnic grouping in the United States, mixed race, and also sometimes, again, referred to, particularly in the Obama era, as biracial, when we're not busy calling him post-racial, but by which we mean racial. But to the extent that a DNA swipe shows mixing, there is certainly nothing new about mixing. Our ancestors have been mixing it up since the first mothers left Africa, certainly as Bob emphasized. But certainly in the United States of America, there are very few isolated populations. And I believe there's a statistic, I was trying to find it and I couldn't find it in time this morning, but that shows anybody who's been in this country for 3 generations almost certainly has a recent African slave ancestor, not somebody coming from migratory patterns of Africa in 10,000 years ago, but it is probably a descendant of a slave somewhere along the line, just as when Annette Gordon Reed's pressure to have the Jefferson family tested, Sally Hemings's relatives showed up all over Staten Island with people popping up saying, I can't believe I'm related, that I'm living next door to a black person, even though up until that moment, she had been, or the descendants, most of Sally Hemings' descendants had been had passed, so-called, into the white population. Now, not only do genes not assign race, neither do they have anything to say about the cultural practices we usually refer to as ethnicity or identity. And the absurdity of thinking otherwise is highlighted by one of the Penn State students, who was a warm, brown-colored young man pictured in cornrows, who said that even though he tested at, quote, 48% European, he values his blackness, since both my parents are black. He went on to muse, just because I found out I'm white, I'm not going to act white. And the article ended with an observation that whatever his genes say, the young man will always likely be seen as black, at least by white Americans. And so there's some narratives buried in here which I think really contribute or make or rationalize the irrationality of race. And the narratives that perform that kind of making consistent of what is inherently inconsistent are as follows. That little quote I just gave you is one in which genes speak race, whatever his genes say. So genes are speaking race. Whiteness, on the other hand, is a biological inheritance that can be consciously acted. He's not going to act white. And blackness is not defined by that, but black is defined by the eye of the white beholder. He will not be seen as anything other than black by the white beholder. Now, again, if history has shown us anything, it is that race, again, is contradictory and unstable, yet our linguistically embedded notions of race seem to be on the verge of transposing themselves yet again into a context where genetic percentages act as the ciphers for culture and status, as well as economic and political attributes. And in another generation or two, the privileges of whiteness may indeed be extended to those who are half this or 30% that. And again, the question of whether we're mutts, as Obama described himself, or not, is again, disguises the degree to which we are all mutts. And I'm really intrigued by Essie Mae Williams Washington, or Washington Williams, Essie Mae Washington Williams, who was the daughter of Senator Strom Thurmond, again, in terms of the incoherent categories of how we describe race. In her 70s, it was discovered and affirmed by the Thurmond family that Strom Thurmond was her father by his black maid. And just consider this. She had lived her life, most of her life, as a Negro, quote unquote. Then, after a certain point, she identified as an African American. Then she attended, or when she was young, she attended a, quote, all-black college. I mean, I was just reading some of the descriptions of her in the wake of that publicity. She attended an all-black college. She was Negro, African American, all-black. In her 70s, suddenly, when Thurmond's paternity became publicized, she was suddenly redesignated as biracial. Now, it's also interesting when we think about other forms of mixed race ancestry. When I think of Tiger Woods, Kimora Lee Simmons, alternatively thought of as African American or biracial, but rarely as Asian American. In Asia, Tiger Woods is seen as half Vietnamese. He's actually described, I was reading in a British paper that a friend of mine brought, half Vietnamese and half Thai, because that's what his mother is, which was interesting. I mean, they didn't even consider his African American. It wasn't mentioned in the article. Now, in contrast, many parts of Latin America, like Brazil or Mexico, assign race by a process that is not like ours. Ours is a process called hypodescent. That is to say, you take the status of the lowest status parent, whether it's race or whether it's religion, whether it's ethnicity or tribe. Now, we're at an interesting demographic moment where, with many people from Latin America and Central America coming into the United States, we have these kind of clashing notions of that are not quite so much hypodescent as a process called hyperdescent. And that's when a person of mixed ancestry has any ancestry of the dominant social group, such as European, then they get to identify themselves as European or white. Even though they may also have African or Indian parents. And as more Latinos have become citizens of the United States, we have interesting examples of this cultural cognitive dissonance. And so if you think, for example, about two singers like Beyonce Knowles and put her next to Jennifer Lopez, phenotypically, they look very, very similar. I apologize for not having any pictures. I'm still mastering, despite Shelley's best attempts, the PowerPoint. But if you put them together, they actually look like they could be sisters. But again, Beyonce Knowles is African American, and she is generally referred to as Black or African American. And Lopez is generally thought of as white, particularly among her Latino fan base, or Latina, sometimes she's called Latina, among the rest of us. General sort of white and African American population distinguish her as Latina. But she's almost never called Black, and I've never heard anybody call her biracial. Now, again, and I think that's because of these two alternating systems we hold in our heads simultaneously that allow to see two people almost physically identical, but we hold them in completely different categories just because it's presented to us as such, which again is testament to the malleability of these as categories. And among Native Americans in the United States is a combination of both hypo and hyperdescent, confused and encouraged by the interventionist history of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Anita Hill, for example, is very substantially part Creek Native American, but the narrative about her is entirely about African American origin, and membership in many tribes remains closed to those who have any discernible mixture of African ancestry, but not to those with all kinds of discernible mixtures of European ancestry. Now, I want to give another example from popular culture, and because I so love the New York Post as an endless supply of wild examples of almost everything. But there was, about a year ago or two ago, I guess it had to be 2 years ago now, the New York Post had a front page story about Angelina Jolie adopting her last adopted child, who was Pax, the child from Vietnam. And it described the picture, and Angelina Jolie is sitting in profile, the child is sitting in profile, there's a warm sun and a halo, forming a halo around their heads. And the picture is described as a stunning mother-child portrait of the two, and their faces were aglow with interracial bliss. Now, the lower half of that day's very same front page, right underneath it, under the fold, was given over to a second, more somber story, entitled Baby Bungle, White Folks' Black Child. It trumpeted a, quote, Park Avenue fertility clinic's blunder that left a family devastated after a black baby was born to an Hispanic woman and her white husband. Long Islanders Nancy and Thomas Andrews had had trouble conceiving after the birth of their first daughter. They employed in vitro fertilization, and baby Jessica was born. Now, Jessica is slightly darker skinned than either of the Andrewses, a condition that their obstetrician initially called an abnormality and that she would lighten up. Subsequent paternity tests did show that Nancy's egg was fertilized by sperm other than her white husband's, and the couple sued. Now, again, if this were all there was to the story might simply fall within the growing body of other technological mix-ups, resulting in what some have called wrongful birth suits for lost eggs, failed vasectomies, malpractice, broken contract, and so forth. And again, I'm not denying that there is a legally recognized exception that a certain standard of care will be observed in the handling of genetic material. It's basic tort. But what was distinctive about this case, and really interesting, I think, was that the parents also tried to bring a claim. Ultimately, I will say, for now at any rate, I was comforted to see without success the judge struck this down. They brought a claim for Jessica, the little girl's pain and suffering for having to endure life as a black person. The Andrewses expressed concern that Jessica, quote, may be subjected to physical and emotional illness as a result of not being the same race as her parents and siblings. They were distressed that she is, quote, not even the same race, nationality, or color as they are. They described Jessica's conception as a, quote, mishap so unimaginable that they had not told many of their relatives. Apparently telling the New York Post must have come easier. We fear that our daughter will be the object of scorn and ridicule by other children, the couple said, because Jessica has characteristics more typical of African or African American descent. So while we love baby Jessica very much as our own, we are reminded of this terrible mistake every time we look at her, each and every time we appear in public. Now, of course, one wonders what this construction of affairs will do to Jessica when she is old enough to understand. But here's the really interesting part. When I turned to other media accounts, I found a picture of the family from a 2006 greeting card, no less. And Jessica looks exactly like her mother and elder sister. Now, it is true that Jessica is really only slightly darker than her mother, and that her hair is a little curlier than her sister's. But all three females are pretty clearly African descended. As one of my students put it, if anything, it is the paleness of the father's skin that marks him as the different one. And the picture underscored the embedded cultural oddities of this case, the invisibly shifting boundaries of how we see race, extend intimacy, or name difference. Now, according to the New York Post, as one media source, Mrs. Andrews was Hispanic, and apparently, by the Post's calculations, one Hispanic woman plus one white man must equal what they described a white couple. The mother, according to the New York Daily News, however, was described as a light-skinned native of the Dominican Republic. Their narrative seeming to indicate that while she may not be white, she's also not black. No matter which of the many media accounts I looked at, each narrative implied that if the correct sperm had been used, the Andrewses would have been guaranteed a lighter-skinned child. But again, the fact is that most Dominicans trace their heritage to some mixture of African slaves, indigenous islanders, and European settlers. And as dark skin color is a dominant trait, it could be that the true sperm donor was as white as Mr. Andrews. But that probability or possibility is exiled from the word boxes that contained this child. Not only was Jessica viewed as being a race apart from that of her parents, she was even designated a different nationality in the claim. This latter most startling for its bloodline configuration of citizenship itself. According to this logic, discrimination is no longer a social problem that implicates all of us and our institutions as unloving or under-inclusive. Discrimination